Okay, our next presenter is here, and it's an honor to introduce her. And her presentation is on opioid litigation. So, Madam Attorney General Ethel Branch was appointed by President Nygren as the 13th Attorney General of the Navajo Nation. Most recently, Ethel co-founded and served as the Executive Director of Ye Holni Do, which does business as the Navajo Hopi Families COVID-19 Relief Fund. As the Navajo Nation's 11th Attorney General, Ethel worked on a broad range of issues that impact the Indian nations. Specifically, she directly oversaw and coordinated the legal and public relations work associated with the Navajo Nation's response to the Gold King mine spills, Wells Fargo's unfair business practices on the Navajo Nation, President Trump's attempted revocation and replacement at the Bears Ears National Monument, and abuses by opioids manufacturers and distributors to the tribal nations, to tribal members. Ethel graduated from Harvard College in 2001, earning her A.B. Cum Laude in history. In 2008, she received a J.D. from Harvard Law School and an MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. So without further ado, I would like to have Attorney General Ethel Branch come up. So if you can give her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all. Yat Aish, A. Ethel Branch Yansha, Bean Patwini Nishle, Nakai Bashas Chin, Sinajani Dachache, Aronaka Deshana. East Canyon Diablo Det Nasha, Loop Chapter, Asia Chapter, so a little far from home here. But good to be here in the nation's capital. And of course, I spend most of my time here at the Department of Justice. We are located just a little south of the President's office and a little bit southeast of council chambers. But right now we are temporarily partially housed in Admin Building 1. But it's good to be here with all of you to talk about our opioids litigation. And good to see all of the interest. It was really great to see the full parking lot out there. And I wish I could have attended more of the events today. Hopefully there's somewhat of a summary of the presentations that I can look at later, because it would be really interesting to get more in-depth updates on the extent of the impacts that opioids are having in our community now. But at the time that we filed our litigation, we weren't seeing really present impacts the way that other jurisdictions were seeing them. And we just knew that, it takes a little bit of time for things to hit Navajo Nation, at least to appear in our data and for us to feel those impacts. So we did have some questioning actually on whether we should even be filing the litigation from internally here at Navajo Nation. But we were very confident when you looked at the numbers, the data for local counties for Navajo Nation and the volume of sales of opioids in those communities. We knew that there was a high volume of opioids making its way to Navajo Nation and that were having an impact even though we weren't seeing that in some of the data indicators. So we proceeded with the litigation. I'm very happy that we did. And it's been going to bring significant benefit to the nation. So, how did it begin? Governments in the United States started filing lawsuits predating 2018 in response to what was being identified as the opioid epidemic. And of course, the defendants, and there were a number of different types of defendants. There were the doctors who were issuing the prescriptions, there were the pharmacies that were fulfilling the prescriptions, there were the manufacturers who had the extensive marketing campaigns. And so those parties were being accused of fueling this crisis to advance their profits, and of course downplaying and misrepresenting the risks of opioids. And so how we got involved was, as these lawsuits were being filed nationwide, a number of tribes were also participating as well. And we felt that it was important for us to participate as well and make sure that any impacts happening at Navajo Nation were being mitigated, and that in the course of litigation we could secure funding to take on that challenge of prevention and response and remediation, essentially. So when I was Attorney General last time, we proceeded with a lawsuit, a filing, and it just so happened that it was organized into multi-district litigation, like the tobacco litigation, for example. That's another MDL where there are just so many lawsuits all over the country addressing the same thing, essentially. It gets organized into what's considered a multi-district litigation because it's in all of these different courts, multi-district, and relating to the same thing. So everything got consolidated, and a lot of the cases were consolidated based on the plaintiffs. And there were discussions about how the settlements would proceed and whether the tribal settlements would be treated as part of a state settlement, and then the tribes would get their share from the states. And I knew the judge because he's also an alumni of Harvard Law School, and I had met him at one of our alumni functions. And so I went out there and advocated directly to the judge and to the other state attorney generals to say that we shouldn't just be lumped in with the states and have our money coming from the states. We need to be there at the table directly as a sovereign. And we had special interests unique to the challenges that tribal nations face. And so we were able to get carved out separately and have that direct seat at the table distinct from the states. And so that's really helped us to recover more funding to respond to this challenge in our communities. So that was really lucky convening of circumstances there. But this is the main litigation. It was administered out of the Northern District of Ohio. So when we had litigation meetings, and I didn't go to too many of them because we had special counsel that we hired that does this type of litigation, manages the cases, is collecting the data. It really takes an army of attorneys to do this. So we had a couple of law firms on contract assisting us with this and really managing the day-to-day of the litigation. And so they were mostly the ones in Ohio attending all of these meetings and sorting through the litigation. So, out of that, there was a tribal leadership committee that was appointed by the judge, and they coordinated the tribal litigation and dealt with all of the tribal claims. And so they were able to reach settlement with a bunch of the manufacturers and distributors. And a lot of those guys file bankruptcy. This is typical for businesses. If they're getting sued, then they'll just file bankruptcy and move their assets to another company. And so we did see a lot of those efforts here. But there were a lot of efforts along the way to make sure that they weren't able to just move their assets somewhere else, to ensure that we were able to secure funds in the course of the litigation and settlement. So for those situations where there is a bankruptcy, and that actually is the case in with many of these companies, then we participate in the bankruptcy proceedings to make sure that some of those assets come back to the litigating parties or settling parties. And so all told, if we're able to recover everything, we would be looking at a total recovery for all Indian tribes of $1.5 billion. But it doesn't come, we don't recover that all at once, unfortunately. Some of you have heard of what the nation's recovered so far. So as the dollars come in, then they will be distributed to the plaintiffs, including the nation. But it takes a while, particularly with the bankruptcy proceedings, and there's possibilities of other folks getting involved, like the federal government, asking to look at the situation a little more closely and decide whether they feel like the bankruptcy proceeding should include payment of these funds. So it's a complex process to even recover those funds, and that's where we are right now in this process. In terms of where we are now, let's see, there was a distribution matrix developed by the court. There was a number of Indian tribes that were litigating on this matter. My guess is probably, I don't know, maybe 30 to 50 tribes. And so the way they distribute it is based on this formula. And the formula is designed to make sure that the tribes with the greatest injury recover the greatest amount of funding. And so some of you guys are probably familiar with how the CARES Act dollars and the ARPA dollars were distributed based on a formula, something kind of like that. So part of the calculation is the population that you're talking about, so tribal enrollment, and some of it is based on other factors as well, like data from healthcare type sources, and then also just the data on where the opioids were being distributed. So that is the model that they're using to distribute the funds to the plaintiff tribes. And the most recent recovery was with McKinsey and Company. I think last August we were able to recover funds from them. So we received that one-time distribution. I think it was like 65 million, something of that nature. I think we have it here in the slides. So that was really great, and now those funds are with the nation, ready to be utilized, but there is a process that has to be set in place in order to utilize those funds because of how the nation spends money. Of course, there are more settlements that are moving forward, as I mentioned. Some of them are in the bankruptcy process, so we are expecting to receive additional settlement dollars. So to date, we've received $82 million in settlement funds. And then we also have an allocation of Narcan nasal spray for 10 years. We're supposed to be getting almost 6,000 doses annually. And then we do have a reporting obligation on an annual basis to the Tribal Abatement Trust, and we just explained what we're using our settlement funds for and the settlement assets. I imagine we're also reporting on how we're using the Narcan and distributing that as well. And unfortunately, to date, we have not spent any of our funds, and we'll kind of go into that a little bit more here in a moment. In terms of what is eligible, so the judge in this particular case was very careful in working out these settlements. He wanted to be sure that these dollars would actually go back into addressing the opioid pandemic or epidemic, and unlike the tobacco settlements where he felt like a lot of that money had been utilized to invest in capital infrastructure or things that weren't as directly relevant to tobacco use, particularly among young people. So here we have much more restrictive use of funds. And so here are kind of broad categories. It can be used to address the treatment of opioid use disorder itself, as well as co-occurring substance use disorders or mental health issues. And so some of the examples are support and enhancement of existing programs Fortunately, at the Nation, we do have a very robust behavioral health services program. For some tribes, they don't have that infrastructure yet, so they're able to use it to establish new programs. You can use it for construction or other capital expenses as long as it's related to the response or prevention. Of course, to fund ongoing services and other non-capital expenditures. And let's see. This reference is at the bottom, Schedules B and D of the Tribal Opioid Settlement. So I think you can find those documents online, and those go into all of this in a little more detail. I do have some additional detail here. So in terms of treating opioid use disorder itself, which is addressed under Schedule B, you can utilize the funds to expand the availability and access to treatment, such as through telehealth services. I think that's something that would be really useful here at Navajo Nation, particularly with providers, the difficulty of recruiting providers locally. I think there's real opportunity with that. And then you could be supporting your permanent infrastructure or even developing mobile intervention and treatment services. Treating trauma for individuals and their family members, for folks who suffer from opioid use disorder, can be utilized to train healthcare personnel to address such trauma. For example, just even identifying that somebody is struggling from opioid use disorder. You can use it to provide evidence-based withdrawal management services, such as counseling and behavioral health therapies alongside medications. And then additionally, you can provide incentives for behavioral health practitioners to come and work in this community. And that can be through incentives like training, scholarships, fellowships, loan repayment programs, and then also specific recruiting for culturally responsive and trauma-informed treatment to community members. And then also supporting the workforce development for addiction professionals who work with individuals with OUD, and then the co-occurring substance use disorder and mental health challenges. Okay. You can use it to support people in treatment and recovery. So that can include a wide range of services: counseling, transportation, education, job placement, job training, or childcare, also housing. So that could be supportive housing as somebody's getting treatment, could be emergency housing. Of course, when we're talking about this, one of the things that I think about, just given my work at the Department of Justice, is Operation Rainbow Bridge and the sober living home crisis in Arizona. Some of the things that are described here as eligible for funding, to me, ties into an opportunity to fund a response to that challenge as well, like the emergency housing that we had a need for, that we continue to have a need for because the crisis is ongoing, and we continue to see tribal members being displaced from facilities as enforcement measures move forward, and just as patients become more familiar with the risks in these homes, and they start to understand what is acceptable and what's not in terms of how they're treated. Inpatient and outpatient facilities, recovery houses, detox facilities. And when we're talking about the sober living home crisis, it includes all of this. It's residential facilities, it's kind of group home facilities, as well as smaller facilities with people kind of transitioning out of services. And then you can utilize the funds to provide connections to care, such as funding the screening programs, so funding crisis stabilization centers, and then you can also collaborate with nonprofits and faith-based groups to provide outreach. And this is really, a lot of this is going through the response part of what the funds can be utilized for, but then there's this whole other area that is focused on prevention as well. Okay, in terms of connections to care, we kind of went through that, the screening, and then supporting hospital programs, crisis stabilization centers, the partnerships with nonprofits and faith-based organizations. Can also include working with schools and parents to help folks seek treatment for children who are high risk or maybe using opioids or dealing with a substance use disorder or mental health issues that really make them more susceptible to opioid use. The bottom portion is really just talking about the prevention component as well as intervention, treatment, and recovery programs, particularly for young people. So this is, even though the judge made it specific in some regards, like more restrictive than, say, the tobacco settlement dollars, it's still pretty broad, right? It's prevention-based, and it's also intervention and treatment-based. So there's a wide scope, and it's not focused only on responding to opioids, but also the co-occurring substance use disorder and mental health challenges as well. And then there's an opportunity also, these are really like high-risk populations, right? So services that could be targeted prevention-based services that could be targeted to incarcerated individuals, and then pregnant or parenting women, particularly babies with neonatal abstinence syndrome, and then supporting family members of someone who has opioid use disorder. And this could be someone like a parent or a grandparent that has to take in their grandchildren or great-grandchildren and take care of them while the patient is either receiving services or struggling with the disorder. And of course, the funds can be used to kind of create that response system, the stronger response system with law enforcement, correctional personnel, and judicial personnel as well. There's the ability to use the funds for first responders. It's really, again, pretty broad, even though it is focused on opioids and, of course, substance use and mental health as well. So first responders who may have experienced trauma or who might experience trauma, building resiliency among those individuals, and training and technical assistance to abate the opioid epidemic, such as funding regional planning efforts, development of dashboards to track and assess the impact of opioid. It says opioid settlement funds, but I think it's really opioids. So a good example of that is the dashboard that was used for COVID. That was really, really useful to kind of see the numbers and track how the community was being impacted by that. I think that'd be cool if we had something like that for opioids and also substance use disorder and mental health challenges as well. It can be utilized for abatement research. And this is cool, researching non-opioid treatment for chronic pain, because that's how a lot of people get using, right? They start to use because they had some kind of surgery or something and they needed that significant pain mitigation. And then, let's see, community workforce development and training. Again, focused on recruitment and retention of qualified healthcare professionals. This is my favorite part of what is eligible for use for the opioid funding, the settlement funds. So, and this is under Schedule D, and so this can be utilized to fund traditional activities, and so it would be focused on culture and healing, like the culture really building resiliency in the community, and kind of as an intervention to keep kids on the right path, prevent them from intervening in a high-risk situation, keeping kids on the right path, and then of course helping them to cope without having to turn to substances, and really building that resiliency. And you can see the language in the documents actually does say that it can be used to help address historical and intergenerational trauma, and feelings of cultural loss. So that could be the underlying root cause, or a contributing factor to addiction. So this is really, really great, and hopefully this is a direction that leadership goes when they come up with the proposal on how to utilize the funds. So there's some really great stuff in here, like sweat lodges, healing to wellness courts, building in that training for cultural competency for counselors and providers. So a lot of great opportunity here, and I want to make sure that these dollars do get spent soon, because we really do need this funding in the community, the support for the community, the response and the prevention. So we have had some meetings with leadership at Department of Health, as well as social services and public safety, to kind of talk through what are the ways that we could, what is a good proposal for how to utilize these funds. And so there's a lot of exciting ideas that have come out of that, and I'm going to talk about those a little more when we get to the end of this presentation. In terms of, okay, so we've had the funds for at least a year, right? So why is it so difficult to spend those dollars? Some tribes don't have this problem, right? Because the Attorney General would be able to say, okay, let's go ahead and make sure these dollars are getting spent. As long as we're complying with the documents from the court, we can go ahead and move forward in utilizing the funds in those ways. But that's not how we do it here at Navajo Nation, unfortunately. So, we go through appropriations, and typically what's done is when there's a big settlement, that funding, like CHISN Fund, for example, that was a huge settlement, and so that was put in a pot in a trust fund, and there was a fund management plan that was developed, and when those dollars are expended, it has to fit within the fund management plan. And in fact, I think for the CSN Fund, they actually require legislation for each expenditure and allocation of those dollars. So it's a more cumbersome process, but once the fund management plan or the expenditure plan is put in place, hopefully there won't be a requirement for additional legislation to spend dollars, and it'll be at the discretion of programs. I think like with the state of Arizona, it's really their Department of Health that gets to decide on how to spend things, so they don't have the delay in the expenditures. So here just kind of says, like, if it's general fund dollars, it goes into the general fund. Here we can't do that because there are the restrictions on the use of funds. And so it's going into a special revenue fund. The fund hasn't necessarily been created, it's just kind of sitting there, waiting for the fund to be created and sort of the rules, the fund management plan to be developed on how the dollars can be expended. Okay, pretty much cover this. Right. So that's kind of where the discussions are right now, is like, what should this fund management plan look like? And really, it could be extremely broad. It could just say it's for whatever is identified in the schedules that come from the court. or it could be broken down like percentages. A certain percentage can be spent on this purpose, a certain percentage can be spent on that purpose. So it just lays out the rules for what the dollars can be used for and how you access those dollars. And then there's some language, like suggestions on language that probably should go in the fund management plan. Okay, and this talks about how the plan would lay out the process for approval of budgets. Okay, and then so the vision for the use of funds. So we've had these conversations a few times over the course of the last year, and just coming in knowing that where things were with the opioid litigation, it was really exciting for me to, not only be there for the filing of the litigation and for the very first stages of the litigation, but to have the opportunity to come back when we receive the settlement dollars. So again, I'm really very interested in what happens with the settlement dollars, because there's so much going on. There's Dene Action Plan, there's the goal for an integrated response, a more culture-based response to the modern day monsters, right? Violence, substance use, and suicide. And of course, there's an interconnection between all of those things. And so this creates an opportunity to design an integrated response, of course, that it fits the criteria of the limitations of expenditures that the judge has put in place. It's an opportunity to have an aggressive prevention campaign and to utilize culture, to have teaching of our youth and having the cultural resiliency and the healing of the community. That's a great potential there. There's also housing, like with the sober living homes crisis. Some of the reason why people have substance use issues can be traced back to overcrowded housing conditions, the lack of housing supply in our community. So even just investing in greater housing supply in our community could have a real impact on substance use in our community, and could go a long ways in terms of prevention. And of course, that's, when people leave here, one of the key recruiting messages that has made the sober living home situation so easy for outsiders to exploit is because they can say, hey, we'll give you housing. And that's a big selling point for a lot of our tribal members. And that's the reason why a lot of them stay in those homes even when they can know that something's not right. And they, they do what they have to do to stay, because at least they have housing, right? They have their own room or whatever. Some of them have their kids there with them. And so if we were to invest in housing, I think that could go a long ways, either in terms of recovery or prevention as well. And then, of course, services to tribal members that are currently not available in the nation. I'm probably preaching to the choir for many of you here, but it's so difficult to hire specialists who can come to the nation and provide the services that are needed, whether that's through IHS or behavioral health services, when it comes to mental health or substance use, or any kind of, well, I was just going to say mental health challenges. So I think the statistics I hear is that there's one licensed psychiatrist on the nation. If that's not true, please correct me. But that's an example of how challenging it is. So being able to, so when we're brainstorming, we're talking about this, it's like, well, how do we address all of these things? How do we really get Dene Action Plan underway in terms of implementation? How do we address the sober living homes crisis? And one question I have is, for the folks who are receiving services in the Valley, how much of that is actually traceable directly to opioids? And so, but in any event, those individuals, of course, are very high risk for addiction to opioids, right? Because a lot of them already have substance use disorders. Many of them also have mental health challenges that they're seeking services for. If we created a campus of care, one of the topics is if we created a campus of care in the Valley to address a lot of these issues, we can cross-pollinate all of that back here on the nation, like a campus of care in Chinle, for example, where we already have behavioral health, building out a new sober living facility that last time I checked is doing really well. The reason why they've built it into a sober living facility is because they weren't able to hire the professionals to make that, higher level care facility. But if you have care providers in the Valley, there's the potential for telemedicine, like those individuals providing services telephonically or through Zoom to people here on the nation. There's the opportunity to have those people come up here and deliver services in person, maybe like 1 week a month. So there's a lot of opportunity to be creative here and close those gaps where we're not able to do these things now, but maybe we can find ways utilizing technology or thinking creatively so that we have the staffing, but maybe not here 100% of the time. And so the needs are being met here on the nation. And of course, as we see with the sober living homes crisis, if we're not able to provide services here, our people still need services, and the people who are really serious about getting services are willing to leave to get those services. Let's see, the training. One of the things that we've talked about is really the scholarship and fellowship component as well. Building the core of young Navajo professionals who can work in these facilities. So I'm hoping that there will be a certain amount of these funds that get dedicated for that purpose. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, the amount of funds that we've recovered so far is something like $80 million. So it's not a huge amount of funds right now. So they'll have to be careful thought into how to make the most of that funding. But with the anticipation that there is the opportunity for additional funds to come later. It's just, unfortunately, we can't predict very easily how much that funding will be or when it would be received. So just to wrap things up, we filed the lawsuit on behalf of tribal members who were suffering from opioid use disorder, and we've received some of the funds that were awarded. There's some aspects of the litigation that is still moving forward and some aspects of the recovery of funds that's moving forward, and we do expect to receive more funding. The funds that we do receive have restricted purposes, even though it's restricted, it is broad in the sense of it can be used to treat opioid use disorder and co-occurring substance use disorder and mental health challenges. But it can also be utilized for prevention as well. And so in that respect, it's relatively broad. And at least for now, without not knowing what the fund management plan is going to look like, there is a good amount of flexibility in how the funds could be used. And hopefully the fund management plan will preserve that flexibility. So there have been some attempts legislatively to, I don't know if the legislation was to create fund management plans, but to at least specify how the funds could be utilized on the nation. So I think in the last council there was proposed legislation, and then there has been discussion of proposed legislation this council as well. So. Okay. All right. So I guess I'm open for questions if anyone has questions.
I have the mic if anybody wants to ask Attorney General Branch a question. Anybody?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Could you speak to some of the partnerships with the federal entities in regard to this litigation? Earlier today, we had a panel from the DEA with special agents from El Paso, Albuquerque, Utah, and Phoenix, and they spoke to some of the limitations on the data that they received from the Navajo Nation. And with this litigation, you mentioned that there was limited data for you to pursue this litigation, but you went ahead and moved forward. So could you speak to some of the partnerships of the data infrastructure to not only track some of the resources that would be allocated to this litigation and also the partnerships? Thanks.
Yeah, so, in terms of data, internal in-house data at the nation, that was the limitation. It wasn't limitation in terms of knowing that there was a problem, because we also had the data on like how much opioid was being moved through pharmacies in counties and communities, cities that were surrounding the nation. So we knew there's a very high volume, disproportionately high volume of opioids that's being sold in pharmacies in Gallup and Flagstaff, Winslow, surrounding communities. And we know that that's not all going to staying in those communities. We know a good amount of that is coming onto the nation. So we had the data to justify moving forward, but it wasn't Navajo Nation data. And some of that data was coming from like the litigation teams. They had research departments, they had former DEA agents. I don't think that internally we were collaborating with the DEA. It was really managed. If we were collaborating with them at all, it was being through the outside council that was also representing like 20 other tribes. Yeah, no, there wasn't that, unfortunately, so. And part of that has to do with just, at the nation, are we even tracking the data? That's one question. And then the other question is, if we're tracking the data, are we doing it in a clean manner so that we can analyze it and extract meaning from that data? And then if we're doing that, then are entities willing to share the data? Like, who knows that this data even exists? Who has access to it and is able to use it for the benefit of the nation as a whole? So those are all different little challenges along the way when it comes to data here.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I just had a quick question in regards to of how the funds could be used towards like advocating for policy development to prevent, I guess, the psychedelic or the pharmaceutical interest groups who are after a lot of our plant-based medicines. Like, we don't want this to happen, like the opioid, and we don't want something to happen in the future when it comes to looking at some of our intellectual properties when it comes to, our plant-based medicines. Like, could some of these funds be used to advocate for the protection and preservation of our way of life? Because I think that's something that we haven't dealt with the nation. We've been trying to move forward with opposing the decriminalization of peyote and mescaline. And that's been a big battle here on the Navajo Nation. But I think some of these funds maybe could be used in that realms of trying to advocate at the national level to bring awareness to pharmaceuticals, looking at our ways of life of protecting our intellectual property. Is there a possibility we could use these funds for that as well?
I don't really think so. There's like the cultural component of like prevention, right, or advancing healing. But what you're talking about is really, it's more advocacy. It's not focused on the community. It's kind of more focused on national policy. I think it'd be hard to justify using the funds for something like that. But you could probably utilize it in terms of building cultural competency in the community, in terms of, you know, teaching young people about traditional healing and plants and whatever that's used, ceremony, to advance healing in the community. But again, I don't think you could focus the advocacy outwardly. So, I mean, the advocacy might happen as a result of the work that you're doing in terms of building resiliency as a community. But like if you were to fund hiring a PR firm or whatever to do advocacy, like I don't think that would fall within the scope.
Are there any other questions?
Too loud, huh? Good afternoon. You were talking about this opioid money that's coming in, and I was thinking about sitting here, and I know that you and me and some others from the Navajo Nation have worked on some of these issues in Phoenix with the Operation Rainbow Bridge, helping our clients and coming to understand that a lot of our people out there are suffering from opioid. And a lot of them are, perhaps some of them were displaced from the residential treatment centers there. And now that the Navajo Nation has opened up the sober living in Chinle, and I was assigned out there to work with the sober living there. And I understand that there is still a gap. There's really no control over the clients. They go on and do whatever they want. And it seemed to me like things like that needs to be looked into, because the turnaround of it, we don't really have a really good percentage of the outcome of people being healed there. For sure, most of them are short-term there. And I think that opening up a detox within the opioid, within the Navajo Nation, would be beneficial. And then talking about the construction, we already have a team with the opioid in Gallup. And there is a group there that are sponsoring this event here. And I look at that, they've been raining there in Gallup for the past 2 years now, going on the third year. And if we tap into something like that and build our own centers here on the reservation instead of paying outside, they would, because it's already here. The opioid group is already here. And I think that would be very beneficial, and to keep the opioid going, and then perhaps the treatment for traditional practitioners to enhance and help our people. And that's what we're about here at the Opioid Summit. How do we step ahead as a traditional practitioner and healer to help our people? What are some of the protocols, or some of the remedies, or the medicine, or the herbs, or the prayers, or the songs that we're going to utilize for these people? And I wanted to tell the people here that, you know, we really don't have a Navajo terminology for opioid. So, and me and some of my traditional practitioners with the Navajo Nation, we sat down and talk about this. And everybody sees and hears that when you get on KTN, you hear people say, medicine is not harmful. It's not the cause. That's the way we look at it. So we say, anna bilakana. Out of different nationality, they're the main ones that make the opioid. It's man-made. It's not grown, and it's not grown out here on the reservation. So that's the word that we use for our opioid. And I just wanted to remind people that, be careful how we say opioid. And that's not a killer. It's the man-made stuff that's a killer for our people. And I just wanted to say that, and I'm glad that you came out and brought this information to us, and looking forward to working with the Navajo Nation and see where we can try to fit in. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mr. Thorne. Good to see you. Yeah, absolutely. It creates a really great opportunity to build the capacity here at the nation to respond. And we went through some of the allowable purposes, and like building facilities, that's definitely within the scope of what could be allowable, and staffing and the incentives to bring people here, whether that's fellowships or loan repayment, to make our programs competitive with IHS, for example, or other healthcare employment opportunities that folks we would be bringing in to provide these services are getting offers of. So, but I think having like a package, thinking through the whole spectrum of things is helpful, because if you just build the building, then that doesn't solve the employment challenge of like, how do you bring in the people who are going to actually administer the detox program, right? The people who are going to run the program. And then there's the challenge of, okay, so once you put someone through a detox program and they're ready to transition out, where's that next level of care? And so like trying to build out that full spectrum of care to bring people to wellness and successful long-term recovery. Hopefully when people are thinking about what to utilize the opioid funding for, hopefully, they're coming to that with thinking about the full system and the full spectrum of needs. And then thinking about, this is just one source of funding. Where could this funding, what piece can this funding address? And then, what are the other sources of funding that can be used to address the full challenge as well? As I mentioned, the Chinle facility was meant to deliver a higher level of care, but unfortunately, it struggled to fill positions to administer that. So just some of the reality in terms of the challenges that we face here in tackling opioids or substance use disorders in our community. But it's a great opportunity to respond in terms of utilizing the settlement funds. And what you said about thinking through, how do you address opioid use disorder using traditional methodologies? I think that's something that could be allowed for funding, right? Is designing the traditional response and putting together the group of individuals that can come up with the terminology, the proper terminology to use, and then also the proper treatment plan, right, in terms of the songs that will be used or the ceremonies that will be used to move someone along that path of recovery. So thank you for raising that really important point, and thank you for the work that you do. I know it's very highly valued by our tribal members, particularly the folks who are going through the sober living homes crisis. I know they really valued having access to your services, and it was great to be able to work with you.
So with that, it concludes our presentation. Thank you, Madam Attorney General, for your presentation. It was enlightening and a lot of information that we can all take forward and look forward to how the funding will be used. So we have another break now, 15 minutes, and then we'll go into our last session. So thank you very much for this great presentation. Yeah,